We'll be talking about digital literacy today, and we have a great panel. So I'm just going to introduce our panelists briefly and maybe give you a chance to talk a little bit about your work because you're all coming at this issue from a slightly different perspective. So I think it's interesting. So Matthew Johnson. Matthew Johnson is the Director of Education at MediaSmarts, Canada's leading Centre for Digital and Media Literacy. He has authored numerous educational resources and designed the Use, Understand, and Engage framework for digital literacy in Canadian schools. His work empowers Canadians of all ages to navigate the digital world safely and critically. Then we have Kinga Petrovai. Dr. Kinga Petrovai is a workplace learning consultant and podcaster with a PhD in learning technologies from Oxford and a master's in education from Harvard. She has a background in electrical engineering and has worked with universities, government agencies, and international organizations to bridge research, practice and skill development. Her podcast, The Art of Science of Learning, reaches listeners in over 100 countries. And I think you just celebrated a milestone in terms of the number of episodes.
Yes, over 100 episodes. So the 100 plus the big celebration.
Thank you. And then we have Erin Keeley-Messier. Erin is the program manager and the sole employee here at iSisters Technology Mentoring, which is a charity dedicated to empowering women and gender diverse people through digital and employability training. With over a decade of experience in the nonprofit sector, Erin specializes in helping individuals overcome barriers to education and employment. At iSisters, she collaborates with partners to deliver tailored digital literacy programs to women in need. So I don't know if you want to take it away, Matthew, and maybe tell us a little bit more about MediaSmarts and.
Sure, thanks. So for those of you who aren't familiar with MediaSmarts, we're a registered charity. We've been around for almost 30 years, and our mission is to ensure that all Canadians, with a particular focus on young Canadians, have the critical thinking and the ethical decision-making skills that they need to understand and to actively engage all of the media that they use and consume. So as part of that mission, we develop a lot of resources, primarily for use by parents or teachers or sometimes young people themselves, but we have developed some resources for general audiences or some specialized audiences. And we also do research, primarily our research project, Young Canadians in a Wireless World, which has been going on since 2001, and it's one of the world's longest running research projects on young people and digital technology.
Thank you. Kinga, do you want to?
Thank you. Yes, as Valerie said, I'm a workplace learning consultant, so I bring research and use research to inform the practice of workplace learning. And mostly it's looking at the systems of learning in an organization. So working with medium to large size organizations to look at what is the system that they can implement so that people are learning continuously and in a really effective way, and using research such as designing impact evaluations, training needs analysis, and such to be able to inform how to improve that learning. And of course, also designing learning, often using technology and innovative ways of us being able to remove the barriers for learning to make it a smooth, integrated part of our day-to-day work. And on the podcast, I have the pleasure of being able to interview people from around the world on different aspects of learning, both the research and the practice and interesting things that people are doing around the world to enable learning.
Hello, I'm Erin. It's a pleasure to be here. As Valerie mentioned, I work for iSisters, which is a quite small charity that supports women in digital literacy and employability. We really do start from the very basics. This is a laptop. This is how you turn it on. This is what the holes in the side do, that sort of thing. And then we work all the way up through the skills that would be needed for employment. And we are constantly reviewing, evaluating our programs in order to ensure that the women that we work with are hopefully getting the most advanced, up-to-date training possible. So we've recently introduced 3 new programs thanks to funding, one for assistive technology, one for online safety and privacy, and one on AI literacy. So very much kind of focusing on the skills to equip these women and gender diverse people with what they will need to progress in their futures.
Thank you. So as a first question, it's a big question. We talk about how digital literacy skills are needed now more than ever. So question is why, but I just want to add to that, right? The definition has evolved over the years. And so how would you define digital literacy in 2025? And what kind of skills do we need today that maybe we didn't need 20 years ago, or that was a part of the definition? Did you want to start, Matthew?
Sure, thanks. So a couple of years ago, we actually more or less merged our concepts of media and digital literacy because we were founded in the 1990s as a media literacy organization. Starting at the beginning of this century, we expanded into digital literacy. And about 5 years ago, it became clear to us that we needed to treat these as a single concept and to develop a theoretical framework that would integrate them both. So we do talk about digital media literacy as a concept, and I think over time, probably in a way, the digital is just going to fall away because so much of our media today is digital. And the things that were unique about digital media are now true of all media, more or less, that they are interactive, that they are networked, that they have ethical and privacy considerations that didn't really exist with traditional media, and so they weren't part of traditional media literacy. So we define digital literacy in terms of skills as first the ability to access media, and of course, as we already heard, access is a precondition, but there are also skills involved. For instance, using um, public Wi-Fi safely, but also accessing in terms of using things like search engines or even training your algorithm when you're on a social network to show you more of what you want to see. The second digital media literacy competency is use, which is the ability to effectively and ethically use digital tools. And so those two are the ones that generally fall into what most people think of as digital literacy. Our third competency is understand, the ability to critically engage with the media that we use and consume. And the last one the third one is understand, and the fourth one is engage, which is the ability to put all of that into context, to understand the impact that media has on you and on society, but also to use it as an engaged citizen, both online and offline. And I think having been in this line of work for almost 2 decades now and working at an organization that's almost 30 years old, I can say digital media literacy is more important than ever because so much of our lives is mediatized and digitized because every aspect from our everyday lives to the biggest political decisions that we're involved in are all playing out through digital media, through networked media, and sometimes through traditional media as well. But all of those skills are relevant to most of us from the smallest to the biggest decisions in our lives.
Well, it's definitely a huge topic, but I think digital skills, they are evolving constantly, and they used to be, as one of our speakers said earlier, that everybody should learn how to code. Everybody needs to start this at a very early age. But I think the most important aspect of digital skills is recognizing that it's constantly changing. It's we need different levels of engagement in it. So in a certain role in your particular life, you need very different digital skills than someone else. And that will also be constantly evolving. I've also often heard that we have to really play with a lot of the tools coming out. Unless you're playing with the new tools, then you can't be digitally literate because you don't know what's new. That's almost like saying we're all just testers because it will literally take your entire life and your productivity if you're going to try out a new tool for your job all the time, for your personal life, so you cannot do that kind of deep dive investigation. But I think digital skills are really important from a very early age to teach about how to critically assess, how to stay in touch by being able to know what's coming out. Maybe you're not going to use it, but you can get the gist from what different tools are, and also have a deep understanding of the critical thinking and understanding, kind of questioning what this is used for, where it's coming from, how it might be developed, have a little bit of background in the way that tools are developed. But all of this from an early age. And then really after that, I think it's not just a matter of the individual to have digital skills, but it's a matter of our organizations and our culture to have the systems in place where you can get nuggets of new information and staying up to date. Because as an individual, it's really, really difficult to take this upon yourself. But we need to develop systems within our schools, our workplaces, our society overall, where there are insights and bits of knowledge that are continuously fed so that we can engage with it in a much more easier way. So I think more than a specific digital skill, we need to be thinking about how to create a system where we are constantly having the key ideas and resources to jump deeper throughout our lives.
So I obviously agree with what both of the other panelists have said. And I think for our learners in particular, although we do cover the very basics of digital literacy, a huge aspect at the moment is the safety side of things, and also just access to services. And that is where, you know, even I was going to say 5 years ago, it's almost 5 years since COVID, isn't it? Big anniversary. Let's say 5.5 years ago, accessing services would have been more straightforward and likely would have involved speaking to a person face to face. But now, if you have somebody who's quite vulnerable, has a number of different barriers, and you expect this person to go online to access housing supports, mental health supports, food security, a doctor, anything to do with their child, all of these things are significantly more complicated now. So while, all these other big ideas are absolutely important on this micro scale, it is about the most vulnerable in our society not falling farther behind, which at the moment I think is probably happening. So I think when we look at kind of what we're doing as an organization, it is about those practical skills as well. So we are teaching them, I hope, quite advanced technical skills for a layperson, but we are referring it to their practical lives so that they understand those implications, which they can then take forward and show to their friends and their family, and it will have a real impact.
Interesting. I just want to go back. So you mentioned your career and we were talking about AI earlier. And as I was filling this panel, Franca asked me to look up potential speakers for this panel, and I went to ChatGPT and I asked who is one of the foremost speakers on digital literacy in Canada, and Matthew's name came up. So there you go. You made it to AI.
I think that's
I'll bet you
scary. I don't know.
Okay, well that's very interesting. So you all brought out great points. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the gaps. So you all addressed some of them, but what are really the big gaps that we have here in Canada, right? In terms of ensuring Canadians have these digital literacy skills. So I don't know. Do you want to start? Just so we started off.
It's a really obvious one. Money. Whether it comes to actually resourcing programs to enhance people's skills, to help anyone learn, or whether it comes to actually the affordability. I mean, Wendy in her speech obviously mentioned about access to the internet. Access. I mean, we as an organization supply laptops to our learners because so many of our learners don't have access to computers. They may have their phone, but if they're learning certain skills, you really do need to learn on a laptop. the assumption that people will have connectivity, that people will be able to afford connectivity. So I think from my perspective, the biggest issue is money across the board.
I mean, I completely agree with that. And again, I think the list is endless on this topic. But something that has come to my mind over and over again when we're talking about digital skills, and just the other day, I was listening to a speaker who was designing digital competencies, digital skills in their organization. And many organizations are doing this. Teachers are receiving curriculum to help address this in the schools. But what isn't happening, or what I don't see happening, is a bigger national or international conversation, not even conversation, but training in some key aspects. Because it is important to have these different ways of defining and training skills. But also, I think we need something that's an umbrella, where, for example, in Finland, the University of Helsinki designed the AI course that's meant for the general public, the Finnish public, but really it's written in English, it's meant for an international audience. But the point is to get their population up to date on what is the very bare minimum essence, understanding, and jumping off point for AI. When the panel on cybersecurity was speaking earlier today, I was thinking again the same thing. This is something where it is very overwhelming and intimidating for small businesses, for individuals, but to have this umbrella of designed and available to the entire world of a high level course and jumping off point for resources. I think that is a really important part of being able to start people down the journey. And then, of course, having all these other programs and training. And also to help people identify what exactly do we mean by digital skills, because everyone's defining it in different ways. And of course they should, because the same digital skill in my work and digital skill in someone else's day-to-day work is quite different. So also having that overall conversation and resources on how to really identify what are the skills that we need. What does that actually mean to have a digital skill? Maybe sometimes what is an attribute? Something we're often talking about critical thinking or creativity. Is that a skill? Is it an attribute? We should have those more bigger conversations around designing this. I, these are tiny bit of the gaps I think that there's more.
So definitely want to echo what both of you said. Certainly very much what we've heard in our research. What I'll add to that first is one thing we find a big barrier specifically is curriculum, because curriculum changes slowly. And I'll give you as an example, it's a good because it's a good news story, is the Ontario language English Français curriculum was updated a year and a half ago. We were pleased to be involved in that process. Before that, it had been last updated in 2006. And so you can imagine how much things had changed in that time. But beyond that, one of the things that is, so far as I know, unique about it in terms of core curriculum in Canada is that it now includes privacy explicitly in a digital media context. And that's always been a big challenge for us because privacy does not fit neatly anywhere. It didn't fit in the old conception of media literacy, which is represented in language curriculum across the country. It didn't fit really in health. It didn't fit in ICT. It was one of those things that we, for again, almost 20 years, have identified as a key digital media literacy skill, but it was a very poor fit in the existing curriculum. And so I'm hopeful that the other provinces are going to be following suit there. But that's just an example of how we can identify something as an essential skill, but it can be very difficult to find a place in the formal curriculum to teach it. And the other thing that I will add simply is leadership, and particularly leadership at the federal level, uh, where, as many people here probably know, Canada in the past was seen both as a leader in media literacy and digital literacy. When I travel internationally, I find people still think of Canada and media literacy in a single breath. And I frequently hate to disabuse them of that notion. And similarly, in digital literacy, we were one of the first countries to, for instance, get every single school in the country connected to the internet. We have a real history and a legacy of leadership. But really, in the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen very little on that front. And so we've been calling for some time for a national digital literacy strategy that will set an example, that will put the federal government in a leadership role in ensuring that all Canadians have the necessary skills, but also have access and all of the other preconditions for being digitally literate.
Interesting. Just going back to the school curriculum, out of curiosity, does that start like junior kindergarten? What age does
It,
digital?
it does. So we'll start in grade 1 at the moment. We're actually just in the process of consulting on the new kindergarten curriculum, which hasn't been updated yet. Uh, and certainly we advocate for digital media literacy starting in kindergarten and really across the K to 12, ideally before and after. It varies from province to province, but here in Canada, or sorry, here in Ontario rather, it begins in grade 1 for now.
Interesting. So I want to dig a little bit deeper. We talked a little bit about some of the barriers to learning digital skills, but I'd like to dig a little bit deeper. You mentioned earlier access, Erin mentioned access to essential services, and I have a little bit of an anecdote on that one as well. My mother, who is 80 years old and partially blind, was robbed at a grocery store a few months ago, and to file a police report, you have to file the police report online. It can't even be done in person. To get a copy of your police report, you have to book an appointment. You have to go in person, but you can't just show up. You have to book an appointment online to go in person. So even just accessing the police is right. Like you almost need digital skills to be able to access the police. So on that note, maybe we could just dig a little bit deeper about what some of the barriers to digital skills. Maybe we'll start with you, Kinga. Just to...
Sure, and I love that story that you shared with us earlier because I think that really highlights a really important aspect that it's not always about skills, or especially when we're talking about digital, it's not always about digital skills. It's about also recognizing, and I think especially in Canada, we're really good at looking at access in terms of, well, this digital resource can be accessed in a myriad of different ways to address your uh, possible disabilities or different situation. But what we're often not thinking is about is what about non-digital? Just as well as we're thinking about digital skills and digital access, we should really be thinking about non-digital as well. For example, for your mother, there should be a possibility of addressing this in person. And same as in schools and in teaching, sometimes there's an assistance. I did quite a lot of research on new technologies and tablets in schools and in education. And there's a huge sweep of, okay, now every teacher will use the tablet, every subject will be taught, everything could definitely be taught better with this new technology. And that's just not true. Possibly a certain teacher is able to use the blackboard, or maybe a certain topic. The best approach is a blackboard or paper and pencil. So we have to really think about, I think often it takes over this digital first mindset and doesn't say, what are we trying to achieve and what is the best tool? And maybe paper is the best tool. Maybe a conversation is the best tool, and focus on the best tool to achieve that rather than saying, how can we get digital to solve these problems? That might be veering off a little bit, right? But I think in addressing these gaps, we also have to really acknowledge that we're not thinking about how to get digital to solve our problems. What are the problems and what tool, digital or otherwise, is the best solution?
Recognizing that people have very varying levels, and maybe my mother is not a great candidate for improving her digital skills in a big way, right? So
And maybe some things it's not just about the person and their ability, it's simply about the fact that the problem
yeah,
has a better solution.
absolutely. Did you want to?
I would argue that was something that could be quite traumatic as well, having to go onto a computer and do something wouldn't you rather speak to a person and have that connection? And I think from the perspective of the learners that we work with, um, a big barrier can be that. It can be that complete lack of confidence. They think, I can't do that. I'm not smart enough to do that. I don't have the skills to do that, whatever. Um, and that will come from a number of kind of traumatic experiences and things from their own lives. But I think that lack of confidence, lack of community, lack of support, and social isolation that has been identified time and again as being a massive issue within Canada at the moment. I think all of those things contribute to people not being willing to try new things or to even kind of take a chance on something. And if you're worried about internet versus buying food that week, and I know somebody mentioned that in the very first panel, I believe, and said, oh, I don't think anyone will I've experienced that. It was a while ago, but I'm not ashamed to say I had to make a decision between paying an internet bill and buying food. That is a realistic situation for a lot of people. And I think that is also going on a bit of a tangent, but I think that's something, there isn't enough awareness maybe within the decision making groups of all of those people who do not have access or who have these barriers or who are just being completely left behind because no one's even thinking of them. They're just not even on the radar at all. I think that's a big barrier.
Can I just add to that, that I really liked what you said, well, not the situation obviously, but I think it's really important what you said about confidence, because very often when we're talking about digital skills and we're talking about knowledge and which is the skill aspect of it and having that education and the resource aspect of it and access. But we're not talking about all the other barriers that can be impacting someone's ability to work with new digital tools or in ways, which is one is confidence. One can be, so there's so many non-technical and non-economic factors that play a big role that should also be considered when looking at all these different aspects. And in the workplace, which is where I spend all of my time in terms of my clients are looking at improving learning in the workplace, there are also a lot of these, often they can be considered as economically very privileged and certainly with a lot of resources in most cases. But there are different types of barriers where they feel very intimidated and inevitably you have a little hiccup in trying something, even a new tool, but you feel intimidated to ask for help. You don't have the time. There's not a system put into place where it can be addressed. And also, you're not going to go to your colleague who looks like they're doing a brilliant job with this new tool. You're not going to say, oh, actually, I'm not really succeeding with this. Can you help me? I mean, it would be great if you could, but there's those other types of barriers in place that we should be considering how we address digital skills or skills in general.
Yeah, and I'd add that in our research with young people, we've really found that as fluent as they appear to be with technology, it is often very shallow fluency. And it's also very platform dependent because they do tend to use a small number of different apps. Um, and that when they're called upon to do something in a different context, that knowledge often doesn't transfer. And even when the within that same app, when how the interface works, it can be a barrier. So we did a research project a couple of years ago where we were asking them about using the reporting features in social media. So when they had seen hate content or when they had seen, at this point, dangerous disinformation, things like that, things that were against the terms of service, we wanted to know, did they report it? Under what circumstances? What were the barriers? And what they told us was that the reporting systems always had a completely different user interface than the app. And they found that to be a huge barrier because at the same time they were doing something that was difficult emotionally for them. It was a difficult thing to do, and they were also having to learn essentially an entirely new app. Uh, so it's important to know this is not something that our society is going to age out of. Uh, It's not something we can just expect today's tech savvy kids to solve the problem when they grow up. They're going to have the same challenges dealing with new technologies that come in or anytime they move outside their comfort zone.
Can I just quickly add on a story to this because I think this is so important with young people. Often we feel that the young generation will they're so talented in technology, and I remember one of my friends, their children was playing with a tablet and saying, "Oh, look how brilliant he is because he can do everything with this tablet." And I said, "No, it's the 10 million Stanford computer science grads that created this that are brilliant so that your child can use it so effortlessly." But also, I was conducting an evaluation at a really major university looking at how, well, anyhow, but part of it was about interviewing professors about how their students were using technology, both in their learning and in their coursework. And I was really shocked by at this really world-renowned university, computer science and engineering professors saying that their undergrads are really starting to slip because they are, again, computer science and engineering are trusting the technology and not questioning what I put in, is that really correct or not when it comes out, and not thinking about that critically, which is, of course, really scary when they're the ones who are supposed to be the most critical and designing this new technology. So it's something that we really do need to make sure that we step back and think about all those different elements that you mentioned as well, that we need to address in these skills because they're not necessarily going to be positive moving forward.
So interesting. Just moving on. So what are some, we talked about some of the barriers. What are some strategies, programs, initiatives that you've seen that have worked and that we can maybe, or some that haven't worked as well? Did you want to start, Matthew, or?
Well, obviously, I mean, we're biased, biased because that is what we do is implement programs. Um, so certainly, what I can say is that it's been really important to have a balance between teaching the technical skills and teaching the critical and the ethical skills. Uh, you need to be doing both of those because otherwise, in many cases, young people don't get the relevance of it. And the other thing is that because digital media literacy is a multidimensional thing, there's always going to be one aspect of it, at least, where people need to learn more. And so when you have a program that has all of these different dimensions, the ones who are already fluent with the technology, in many cases, are not doing critical thinking. And in some cases, the ones who are maybe better able at thinking critically about representation, diversity, bias, issues like that, have more work to do to learn the technical skills. So I think it is keeping that what we think of as a holistic, multidimensional approach to digital media literacy. Not to say you never focus on one thing, but the entire program should try to cover as much of that as possible.
Right. Well, there's two major things that I think are important and good ways of addressing this. One is looking at very research-based programs that engage learners, and the other is looking at the systems in which individuals live and work and study. But in terms of creating large programs that really help the general public, one is that example from Finland with the AI course. The other really good example is also from MIT. I don't know if you've heard of Scratch, but the online programming tool to help small children learn to program. But in addition to that, it's the community behind Scratch, which, first of all, it's a research-based way of helping young people learn the essence of programming, the logic behind it. But the community is really, really interesting because the community means that all those children who are on Scratch and making their own programs, they can also take someone else's program and make changes to it and build on it and discuss it and communicate among each other and figure out what was wrong, maybe that why something didn't work and work together. And the way that they have created this community comes out as an example of good online community management and fostering. But it's again that kind of research-based large programs that are available to the general public on how to be able to learn these skills. So I think this is a really, really important approach, and not just to rely on, as you said, curriculum takes years. And other big part about curriculum is that it may you may say this is what you need to learn, but if the teachers are really on uh, not trained to the full capacity and they feel uncomfortable with the material, then again, that's another hurdle to overcome. So big programs, I think, are really important. The other one is looking at the system in which we survive and work and live to create, for example, in the workplace, a system where there's different small nuggets of learning, different learning experiences, not just courses, but different ways of learning so that the skills that you want people to really enhance and foster and learn, those skills, you create pathways where they have different learning interactions throughout their experience. In this case, the workplace, or maybe the school with the teachers and how they can update and learn new skills. It's not just about courses, but it's about creating a system where maybe on Monday's meeting, we have someone share what was challenging with this new program and if they found a solution. And then when you enter your online system every morning, there's a little tidbit of knowledge, whatever this might be, but to think about the system in which we exist and to help create learning experiences in that.
Love that. Multiple touch points for learning. That's great.
So again, I agree with both of you, obviously. I think when it comes to our particular learners and trying to engage maybe the most marginalized or the hardest to reach groups, I would sort of draw upon the example of one of our longstanding partners, which is an organization called Tungasavika Inuit. They're an Ontario organization that works with the urban Inuit community, and we work with the Ottawa branch of that. And we work very closely with them to ensure wraparound support. So the curriculum and the learning and the skills that they gain and all of that, super important. But what is possibly more important is all the other stuff as well. So TI is able to provide them, for instance, they come in at 10 in the morning and there's food there. So they can get breakfast if they didn't have any. Coffee machine, always on the go, always. And you can get up and you can get a coffee when you need it. Sometimes, especially kind of the first class of the week, it's about having that conversation about, you know, did we have any hard things that happened, whether it's course related or maybe completely unrelated, but just getting a chance to kind of offload a little bit. And by doing so, you're creating a community. You are hopefully helping to then boost confidence. There can be elements of peer support where people are sharing their experiences. There's a real feeling of safety, psychological safety, cultural safety, spiritual safety, whatever you want to call that. Um, and having all of those things in place so that if somebody comes in and they're in crisis mode, those other things can be addressed and can be helped, um, so that they can continue to learn, they can continue to grow, but we're not ignoring those things because ultimately those things have to take priority, don't they? So I think from that respect, the partnership working amongst nonprofits, and I wish amongst other organizations with nonprofits as well, I think is really important, because without all those other supports and soft skills being developed, I think that the programs just wouldn't be successful ultimately.
Very interesting. So I'm looking at time, and I want us to have a little bit of time to talk about misinformation, online safety, that's in critical thinking. We've touched upon it very briefly, but obviously we can't talk about digital literacy without talking about misinformation. We've heard a lot about that in the news. So how do we design that requires critical thinking, right? Like you can't teach misinformation. Like it's not an easy thing to teach. So how do we design programs to teach people to recognize instances of misinformation. And I don't know, do you want to take it away? I'm seeing your eyes. You seem to have a lot to say about this.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that is something that we've been doing a lot for the last few years. And it was kind of funny because up until around 2016, it was a topic that I was always beating the drum about, but I could never get anyone to pay attention to. And around 2016, suddenly people became interested in this information. Um, and we do know one of the great things about that is that you have a tremendous amount of research that's been done over the last few years about what works and what doesn't work. Um, and so one of the things that we know, and I should mention, I forgot to mention, uh, one of the things we're best known for actually now, because it connects to misinformation, is the house hippo. If you're around my age, you probably remember the house hippo. Um, and one of the when we brought that back in 2019, we looked at the reception of the original house hippo ads. And one of the things that we found consistently was that they did not get their point across, that a lot of people who saw them, obviously children, believed the house hippo was real. They didn't get the idea of watching critically. And it also didn't really didn't give you any action items, tell you what to do beyond critically. And that really reflects the research in the last few years, that what we need to teach when it comes to mis and disinformation is not debunking, but discernment. Not to recognize false information or even to recognize unreliable sources, but to tell the difference between reliable and unreliable ones. Because if you focus too heavily on debunking and mis and disinformation, what you're essentially teaching people is that there are sources out there that they can't trust, that there are things out there that aren't true, but you're not telling them how to tell what they can trust and how to identify what is true. And I can say we have an entire generation of kids who had that experience. They've been taught since very early on. You can't trust everything you see online, but they haven't been taught how to trust, how to find what is a source that is worth my attention. One of the big debates that we've had in media literacy over the last few years is the relative importance of what's sometimes called lateral reading, which we call companion reading, which is about looking at evidence relating to a source. So doing a Google search on the source, or looking up on Wikipedia, finding out what other people, what their track record is, getting information about them, or closely, looking closely at the source. Because again, since 2016, there's been a big shift towards lateral reading because there was this explosion of entirely unreliable sources. But at the same time, you don't want to say, well, if it's in the New York Times, you can trust it. Or if it's in the Globe and Mail, you don't have to question it. We still need that classic media literacy approach. But at the same time, doing that reading between the lines, doing that close reading, looking for bias, if you're doing that to a source that is flat out lying to you or is misrepresenting things, a bad faith source, you're just wasting your time. And that's exactly what they want you to do, because you're spending more time being exposed to their messaging. So our program now is based on what we call information sorting. Actually, you start with the lateral or companion reading. You start by, if you're not familiar with the source, if you don't know yet whether or not the source is reliable, you look for external evidence. You don't pay attention to the source itself at all. You look for other evidence that tells you whether or not it's worth paying attention to. And the great thing about that is that when you identify those sources that are worth paying attention to, you have enough attention left. You give them your critical attention. You can do that close reading. You can do that critical reading because you've already sifted out, you've chosen to ignore all the ones that aren't worth your attention at all. And so lateral reading is not about saying this source is 100% trustworthy, don't question it. It's about saying this source is sufficiently trustworthy that it's worth reading critically, and all these other ones that you've sifted out, you just be wasting your time.
Right. So I just read a paper literally the other day because it just came out. And it had a very scary conclusion. So it was written by researchers at Microsoft and at Cambridge University. And basically, what they said is that AI is making us less critical thinkers. And the more that we are comfortable engaging with AI, the less our critical thinking is diminished, which is really dreadful, considering the fact that for the past 10, 15 years, especially in Canada, there's been a huge emphasis on critical thinking skills in schools from K to 12 education. And I think what's really, really important is looking at, again, what you said, looking at the evidence, looking at where it's coming from, really moving away from saying, well, these are possibly most likely trustworthy sources, and really still going deeper and also having a wide breadth of consumption of information. So don't make it a regular that I go to my trustworthy sources. And I remember during my PhD, one of the really important aspects of it is, regardless if it was by a famous professor from a famous journal, you really need to dig in and see how did they do it and kind of take your little gut check as well of like, really, how could you tell from that such a small, or how can you tell something like this from this type of methodology? So also checking your gut and not just, and of course the knowledge that comes along with it, but really digging a little bit deeper and being critical and having a wide angle lens into what you are hearing and seeing and being able to make those judgments. And I think part of this, a really important thing that we should introduce more and more, is having uncomfortable conversations and teaching children how to have uncomfortable conversations. Because if you can say to someone, even if I agree with you, but especially if I don't agree with you, being able to say, don't just say, here are the facts, say, why do you think that? How do you think that came about? What do you think? All these why, how questions to dig deeper and to uncover. And I think that skill is something that we really need to come back to rather than counter arguing and proving any argument. Asking the why and the how, because there's so much nuance in every disinformation, misinformation. We like to put this big stamp on it of like, this is black and this is white. But really, there's a lot of nuance in it. Maybe aspects are true, but the consequence is different and it's not true. So I think it's so important to teach those critical thinking with critical conversations of constantly pulling back the layers.
Again, I agree. Um, I think, and this might be slightly repetitive, but a lot of our learners haven't necessarily encountered things like, an information vacuum or confirmation bias. These might not be things that they're sort of instinctively aware of. Um, and so I think even just having those discussions and starting to, as Kinga was saying, like let's talk. And I guess the internet doesn't really allow for these kinds of conversations. So a lot of the time being able to do this in person is hugely important because then oftentimes you can start to get to that understanding of where things sit, truth, whatever you want to call it. And I think sort of going back to the style of learning and the way that our learners really we try and make everything quite practical. So we try to bring instances that other learners maybe have encountered themselves and using those as learning points and again fostering those discussions so that they can say, oh, wait a second, this makes me think of, because again, tying it back to their own lives is what will ultimately make them understand, make them have that buy-in, and then ultimately, hopefully, go some way towards preventing it. It's a bit optimistic, but you know what I mean.
So you're providing stories of how someone came through adversity. Is that what you mean?
No, the idea of actual instances where they have run into difficulties online, where they have run into misinformation, um, times when that could have actually caused them fairly serious consequences potentially. So obviously all anonymized, and no details are shared. But I think being able to show kind of those real world examples. One of our instructors is. I shouldn't say this, maybe she's very good at deep fakes um, with herself. So she deep fakes herself. Um, and so even just showing how that can be done so easily. Um, and, I think it does cause a bit of shock, but then after that shock, I want to learn a little bit more about this. I want to start evaluating things. I want to start looking at the numbers of fingers on people's hands and things like
That's
that.
such a good way to use those examples in those real world situations that people.
And I did want to say too, a lot of the time it is very basic technical skills that are key to navigating information. So two of the things that we teach that are really important. One is the news tab in Google, because a lot of people, including almost all of the young people that I've worked with, they don't understand the difference between the main tab and the news tab. They don't understand that everything in the news tab, not everything is 100% reliable. There are some things there that maybe are not, that are biased in some way, but every single one is a news source that actually exists. It's an actual news organization. And similarly, just being able to search inside a page, doing Control F or hitting slash. So of course, Wikipedia, we do a lot of unteaching around Wikipedia because it's gotten a very bad rap. You do need to know how to use it, so we teach how to use it. And one of the ways to do it, of course, is to search for the term that is relevant, because Wikipedia articles are long. And so if you want to know, well, is it really true? Someone's saying aliens were built by or pyramids were built by aliens. You don't have to read the whole Wikipedia article on the pyramids. You go to the Wikipedia article, you hit slash or do find in page if you're on a mobile, and you just put in aliens, and it shows nothing. And that tells you, okay, not part of the consensus. So in some cases, these very basic technical skills really are, there are things that people, even young people, sometimes especially young people, don't know, but they are the fundamental skills for navigating information as much as they are for doing the more mundane activities that we associate with basic digital skills.
So on this point, what role do you think social media platforms and technology companies should play, if any, in recognizing misinformation? Did you want to go first, Kinga?
Well, okay. So, what role? Well, this is definitely, so much to say on this, but I think it's really, really, really important that we move away from a very polarized black and white world, because the reality is never black and white, and there's a huge amount of nuance in everything. And I think we really need to move towards that curiosity mindset and looking at the nuances of this is good, this is bad, this is, one or the other. But the role that social media can play in it, I think, is to really inform that. And when we look at knowledge, what is knowledge? I remember, during, there was a lot of discussion about, well, that's been medically proven. That is scientifically proven. And irks me to the core when I hear someone say, well, I believe in science. And that means I believe that this is true. If you believe in science, you should know that science for millennia has been an argument and a conversation. So there is no such thing as this is science. There's been multitude of scientifically proven things that we have disproven. That is why scientific journals are conversation pieces. You come in and you argue and you argue and you argue, and sometimes very strongly held scientific truths are debunked. There's many examples throughout our history. So I think the first and foremost, we need to get to that scientific journal approach, not to the heavy extent of being that scientific, but the fact being that this is a conversation and an argument. And you cannot say this is false and this is true, because maybe most likely aspects are true and aspects are false. So having that dialogue in some way. I don't know how to do it, but as I said, journals, academic journals, scientific journals are conversation pieces. When something is published, it is goes through a rigorous process, but it is by no means accepted as absolute fact. It is there to be argued and debunked, and that's the conversation that keeps going. So I think we need to move back to that and recognize that the world is extremely complex and you cannot label something as disinformation, misinformation, and fact, because there are very few things that can be put into those very clear buckets.
Do you want to?
Yes, I love how well you said that because I was just thinking, oh well, regulate them all. And I know obviously that's completely impossible. And I think it does come down to what you were saying ultimately, Kinga, is that I guess ensuring that somehow that dialogue continues, and that conversation continues. And I honestly I don't know how to make that happen because I mean doom scrolling now is it really is a thing, isn't it? And I think that it certainly for me it makes me want to switch off. But I think having more voices from all sides of the spectrum is the most important thing, ensuring that all the voices are out there. Um, that probably means leadership as well. And that is probably a much bigger conversation.
And can I just add on just quickly add on to what you were saying about your initial feeling being regulate it all? And the question is, who regulates it? So in scientific journals and academic journals, not just in hard science, but in social science and also, but academic journals, first of all, you're already an accredited, trained person to submit it. There are three it's peer reviewed. So there are about three other accredited, educated individuals who go through it, critique it with a very critical lens to say yay or nay or change, investigate this further. And then it gets put into the journal. And it's still not regulated because everyone else is expected to come and say, well, now, actually, this aspect I have proven to be different. So we really need to move away from that mindset because unless you say that this floor is black, and even then, someone who, may say, well, actually, there's different grades of black, and we really need to get into that argument of constantly being able to present the argument, the evidence, and move forward piece by piece. How we do that, I think we can do it, how social media can do that. I'm sure there can be ways of doing that more. But our mindset should be moving towards that constant questioning and reflection.
So we're almost done, Matthew. I don't know if you just want to answer briefly.
Sure, I would just say I think social media companies need to take a long, hard look at how they're measuring success and what they're optimizing for. Because we know there's a lot of evidence that people do not like the way the current social media algorithms optimize for polarization, the way they optimize for excessive use. And I think that in many ways, these companies are pursuing short-term goals that are going to be at the expense of their long-term health. And we have seen that people will vote with their feet when they have alternatives. So I think it's in everyone's interest for social media companies to be looking for healthful, less polarizing ways of optimizing their systems.
Thank you very much. Well, that's it for us. I just want to say thank you, Matthew. I'm so glad ChatGPT sent you our way. And Erin, I'm so impressed with everything you're doing. You really are the definition of a small but mighty team. And Kinga, as always, your insights invaluable. So thank you very much.